And welcome everyone. I'm Christine Hancock. I'm the founder of a global health charity, C3 Collaborating for Health, which is about trying to prevent chronic disease, NCDs, with a real focus on the main risk factors, which are, as I think many people know, smoking, lack of physical activity, what we eat and drink. And I often think that smoking is probably still the one that everybody knows, but has let, to some extent, slide off their radar. We are running a series of international seminars, which used to be breakfast seminars, and with breakfast, and we waited until people from other countries were in London so we could capture them. And I remember our second or third one a long while ago, a wonderful man called Tom Glynn from the American Cancer Society, and he titled his talk on smoking as "Big Tobacco is Smiling," and mainly it was about how the health world was now really concentrating on obesity and the food environment, all of which really important, but that sometimes tobacco and smoking slips off the agenda. And perhaps that's because everybody thinks they know it, which many people do, but there are changes, there are differences and innovation, and some of them controversial, and that's why we're really delighted. I'm especially delighted to welcome Martin Dockrell from Public Health England, and Nick Parle, my co-chair from the Society of Occupational Medicine, who we're really delighted to be running this series of occupational health focused webinars. Over to you, Nick, to continue the introductions.
Thanks, Christine. Morning, everyone. Hope you're all well. So yes, we're very pleased to partner with C3 on these workplace health breakfast webinars. We've got various ones coming up. I think one on the menopause, which is obviously a big issue, menopause in the workplace. And Society of Occupational Medicine, we are a professional society for occupational health professionals, and we produce the Journal of Occupational Medicine and campaign on particular things at the moment, universal access, or continuing for universal access to occupational health. We've got a big summit this afternoon, sort of globally showing how occupational health needs to be there for everyone. And the WHO, I think, did a report with the ILO on Friday showing 2 million people die every year from occupational health reasons. And as part of that is this focus on workplace health, and Martin's going to cover a very important part of it. I'm here in the background monitoring the chat. There's going to be lots of time for questions at the end, so I'll help Martin with dealing with those questions if there's many of them, but I do encourage you to introduce yourself on the chat. You can see Martin's background there on the chat too, a great background in research in public health and harm reduction, researching e-cigarettes since 2009. So we're very pleased. Thank you for your time, Martin. I'll hand over to you. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, this is a pleasure and an honor. Now, see if it's quite so much of a pleasure to swap to my presentation. I hope that the...
You just need to share your screen again, Martin.
Yeah. Here we... So it is a controversial issue, this business of e-cigarettes, and I suppose we were reflecting just before the meeting on the controversy of harm reduction in general. So none of the harm reduction innovations which we now consider sensible and pragmatic were viewed without controversy when they first came into place. And I was involved in some of those controversies. I was involved in some early needle exchanges. And when in San Francisco, the approach led by gay activists was to close down bathhouses. I was involved in London in the flip side, where we went into gay pubs and saunas and cruising areas to give safer sex training to the men who were there. And safer sex, needle exchanges, these things are no longer controversial. But particularly when controversies are emerging, it's interesting how different people with different backgrounds and values look at the same data and they see very different patterns. And so I am not going to claim for a minute that what I tell you is right, is the only possible sensible reading of the evidence. It's my attempt for a balanced reading of the evidence, and I'd be happy to discuss that further. So we've arrived at a consensus in the UK on harm reduction, which people often point out is very different from the reading of the evidence that we get in other countries. And I don't think this is an accident, or at least certainly our consensus isn't an accident. It was part of a project well over a decade long, led by Action on Smoking and Health and the Royal College of Physicians. So when I first started at ASH, I started in 2007. Very soon after that, the Royal College of Physicians produced their first nicotine harm reduction report. We could see this was going to be controversial. So before the publication, we organized a roundtable where people of different perspectives, a closed door roundtable, where people could thrash out their different perspectives. And so that we managed the debate in a respectful way that encouraged people to disagree, but encouraged people to disagree respectfully. This has carried on through similar events, through certainly the whole time I was at Action on Smoking and Health, right up until the Royal College of Physicians did their more recent report on tobacco harm reduction, a report that I was, Nicotine Without Smoke, it was called, and it was a report I was very pleased to be part of. And I've been a co-author on most of the RCP tobacco reports since then. This has been a period under the introduction of e-cigarettes where smoking prevalence has fallen very rapidly. Since 2012, smoking rates have fallen by about a quarter, and among youth, they've fallen by about half. I have to say the official data on young people is not as robust as it once was. The school survey is once every 2 years, and this year the data gathering was suspended because of the pandemic, of course. So, the latest data, official data we have says says it's fallen by about half, but there's a very useful ASH survey, which still happens every year of 11 to 18-year-olds, and that's indicating a similar progress. And as I was updating these slides, I was struck by the e-cigarette use data. And if e-cigarette use among young people has been falling over the last 3 or 4 years, if we had seen a similar progress with smoking, I would be very pleased. And in fact, interestingly, although the US has seen a dramatic spike in youth vaping, they have seen a much faster decline in youth smoking. So I think there's some humility for the UK there. We might have been very good at managing youth use of nicotine, of e-cigarettes, but we have been less successful in reducing smoking. So there's 3 basic questions about e-cigarettes. How harmful are they? Are they any good at helping people to smoke, stop smoking rather? And are they encouraging youth use of cigarettes or indeed of nicotine products more widely? And I think the news is pretty good on all of those. The UK's Committee on Toxicity recently, last year, concluded that vaping is less harmful than smoking, echoing the US National Academy of Sciences, where they also found on the safety issue that e-cigarettes were likely to be, and I quote, far less harmful on the available evidence, but that more research was needed. And that's great, because you can't make a judgment on anything but the available evidence. And I would agree that more evidence on this is always needed. So a little bit about the context of the UK. The US is just in the process of bringing in its federal e-cigarette regulation. We, and as part of the EU, were a bit ahead of the game with this. We had an early age of sale limit of 18. And then when the EU Tobacco Products Directive came and was transposed into UK law in 2016, we adopted limits on nicotine concentration, so 20 milligrams per milliliter, and about, that's a little less than half of a strong US product, and so you might expect 50 for the upper end, but the average, even before for the UK, even before the cap of 20, was around about 18. So we weren't really taking the products that most people were using off the market. Also, there were some very sensible measures on making sure that the containers were tamper-proof and child-resistant. We require information on the safe use of these products and contraindications. We also, our colleagues at the MHRA, have a yellow card system. There are on-pack health warnings, warning about nicotine. The packaging is protected from breakage and leakage. All the products are regulated by all the legal products are regulated by the MHRA, our medicines regulator, not as a medicine, but as nicotine-containing products. And manufacturers have to notify them in advance of marketing of a very large range of details, including flavorings and chemicals. And it is possible, and has been done, that we have removed products from the market that don't comply with the regulations. So that was in 2016, as I say. There was a commitment to post-implementation review to be published within 5 years. That consultation has happened. It started a little over a year ago, and we're just waiting for the HCC colleagues to publish the review. But as you can imagine, they've been pretty busy with the pandemic. So, first bit of good news, are e-cigarettes effective for smoking cessation? I think the evidence is pretty clear that they are. The good meta-analyses, I think, do show that. There are also some really quite good studies from around the world, particularly from the UK and New Zealand. There was probably the most notable of these studies was led by Peter Hayek, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And they gave nicotine replacement therapy, best combination nicotine replacement therapy, to the control arm. And the users could swap round there. So a good smoking cessation advisor will try you out on one course of medication, but if that doesn't work, if the patches and gum isn't delivering the nicotine fast enough, strong enough, then they'll swap something round. Or if you're getting an irritation from the patch, they'll try something else. And that was the best English stop smoking service provision, because in England, almost every local authority has expert behavioral support plus nicotine replacement, plus pharmacotherapy available to any smoker who wants it. So that was the control arm, pretty good. Not really usual care, but best care. And the intervention arm was a standard e-cigarette, carefully chosen for ease of use and effective nicotine delivery, also supported by behavioral support, the same kind of behavioral support. And Peter found that in these conditions, they were about twice as effective as best combination nicotine replacement therapy. And so at 12 months, there was a 20% quit rate. And they were at about a fifth of the cost as well. So the two nicotine delivery options, e-cigarettes, were about a fifth of the cost. So in that context, and we have another study I cite here from New Zealand, but there are a bunch of others, all brought together, in fact, last week in a Living Cochrane review, which finds about the same thing. So in the context of a clinical intervention, they seem to be about twice as effective, though Cochrane point out that we need more data for to be more confident of the scale, but I think all the good RCTs find them at least as effective as NRT and up to twice as effective, depending on the context. Of course, that's not how most e-cigarettes are used. Most e-cigarettes are used when they're used in the quit attempt, are used by individuals buying them online or in a shop. They might get some advice online. About 5% of quit attempts in stop smoking services in England are supported with e-cigarettes, but mostly it's people going alone. And I was interested to read just yesterday a nice study by Ruth Malone's group, which found that, well, yeah, they probably were effective, at least as effective, but Ruth's team came down on the side of advising against these for smoking cessation because of the unknown risks. But she pointed out, importantly, I think, that a number of the studies showed that a key to successful quitting is getting enough nicotine from your e-cigarette. And that makes sense because we already knew that for 20 years, that with nicotine replacement therapy, you have to get strong enough nicotine for long enough to get you over the cravings before you start to cut down. We can see that's similar with e-cigarettes. So people who use a vape a lot in the quit attempt are much more likely to stop smoking or just use their e-cigarette a lot, whether they're making a quit attempt or not. They're a lot more likely to quit successfully than those people who just use it occasionally, maybe at weekends. And Ruth points out very sensibly that her assessment of the US data, survey data, doesn't include that important nuance. Anyway, here's another bit of data which I flagged up earlier. This is from the ASH study. We started this while I was there back in 2013. It followed the establishment of a much larger adult survey, but it's the nice kind of unbroken data that we have. Smallish sample size, I have to say, but a couple of thousand young people, but it's unbroken data, and it's the longest unbroken data set on youth use in the UK. But when we combine it with other studies, so we combined it, Linda Bowles and team and I, and my team, combined it with 4 other UK youth surveys, all showing pretty similar results. And between us there, we were able to get a joint sample of about 60,000 young people. So you can see that top line, trying an e-cigarette maybe once or twice, that did pick up quite sharply in the early days of their availability. Trebling, and that was a headline that we saw in the media. Youth vaping trebling in 3 years. At which point it stopped rising, and the media were no longer interested. And for the last 3 years, it's been just a little bit below this, the trebling figure. And now we have the lowest rates of experimentation, trying once or twice since 2014. But that's experimentation, which is interesting and important, but I think much less important than regular use. And so weekly use we see rising to, at its peak, about 3% of 11 to 18-year-olds. And use more than weekly, look, all these very low levels are pretty much within the confidence intervals. That line's pretty flat. Maybe we got up to round about 2% at its peak in 2018, and now maybe it's lower, but it's a low and flat line, which is very reassuring, and not really what they saw in the US, where they saw a sharp increase in frequent use. So first, I would say that there's no youth epidemic, and second, I'm not really sure that the language of epidemic is useful for describing or understanding young people's behaviors. I think, I don't know if you remember when you were that age, but when I was that age, I was experimenting with stuff that I wouldn't then and don't now consider to be diseased. Okay. So what about this business of whether they're less harmful? And again, I mean, we'll come back and look at some data so you can make your own mind up, but e-cigarettes are not risk-free. There's no doubt about that. I think there are, especially unregulated products, there are definitely risks, and there are risks with inhaling anything deep into your lungs, any foreign gases and fluids. So I quoted the US National Academy of Sciences. Now, in general, I think it's fair to say that the NASM report was very, very cautious about e-cigarettes. They believed there was evidence in the US of a kind of gateway effect to smoking. I know some of the authors dissented from that, but and I think that conclusion is requires a particular reading of the evidence. But they also were clear that they thought that e-cigarettes were not effective in smoking cessation. And as I say, the latest Dockrell review finds that not only are they as effective as nicotine replacement therapy, but they're more effective, perhaps twice as effective. But this was a conclusion on harms, a conclusion with which I can agree with every syllable. Lab tests of e-cigarettes in vitro, short-term human studies suggest that e-cigarettes are likely to be far less harmful than combustible tobacco cigarettes, but more research is needed. The US Annual Review of Public Health that same year was a paper by David Levy and David Abrams, if I remember correctly. They were much more robust. They believed that in fact, e-cigarettes were so much less harmful that they provide a means to compete with and even replace combusted cigarette use, saving more lives more rapidly than previously possible. And that seems to me an ambition worth following. Amy Fairchild, I think at the time at the University of New York and now gone to Texas, she says, comparing the UK and the US, the UK, which embraced nicotine vaping harm reduction, has been able to accomplish appropriate regulation that has managed both youth nicotine uptake and helping smokers to quit. And so Amy is probably one of the academics who is most sympathetic to the UK approach. Now, let me just tackle this harm reduction thing while we're here. We don't mean dual use. We don't mean smoking and vaping, cutting down the smoking a bit. We see a lot of that. And if that's a transitional thing, fine. As I said, vapors get the smoker to vape as much as possible to replace smoking completely. But it is the replacing smoking completely, the total cessation of inhaling tobacco smoke that we are after. And we use exactly the same standard for that we have for 20 years. Stopping smoking is what we mean. And the harm reduction bit, in what sense is that harm reduction? Well, we're, as with NICE guidance that came out, again, I think about 2015 on tobacco harm reduction, you can use nicotine, carry on using nicotine to replace the smoking. And long-term nicotine use seems to be, well, if not risk-free, and certainly not risk-free to everybody. I wouldn't recommend it to people, for example, with cardiovascular disease, although I would recommend it in preference to smoking. I think there's some groups for where the data leave us more reason to be concerned. And for example, in pregnancy, I think we simply don't have the data on safety that would allow us to make any kind of recommendation there. And then I've got, there was a nice short paper in Nature in 2020. Health improving and life-saving interventions are being denied to smokers who want to quit smoking, lead healthier lives, and avoid premature death. And that was probably one of the most robust statements of this position seen in a major, one of the top flight scientific journals. So far less harmful. I promise you'll look at the data. And on the left, you can see nicotine delivery from cigarettes, this dual use of cigarettes and NRT, dual use of cigarettes and e-cigarettes, nicotine replacement therapy only, and e-cigarettes only. And so e-cigarettes only and cigarettes only, those are broadly similar levels of nicotine delivery. So we can see head-to-head the e-cigarettes being used by these vapors was roughly similar to the in delivery to the nicotine delivered to those using cigarettes only. Those who were dual using with cigarettes and e-cigarettes, so these are real enthusiasts, they were getting much they were getting what appears to be a higher level of nicotine, and those using NRT only were getting much lower levels of nicotine. And that might have been by design. When I used to run quick groups, smokers would often try and use as little nicotine replacement therapy as possible. And I used to be constantly encouraging them to use it strong enough and long enough to give themselves a good quit chance, because low nicotine replacement or prematurely withdrawn nicotine replacement was associated with greater relapse to smoking. So if you look at some of the, so that's the nicotine on the left, and we've got one of the principal toxicants in cigarette smoke, NNAL, and you can see highest in cigarettes only. So this is a product of tobacco combustion, really very high, and lowest in the e-cigarette only group, and that's slightly lower than the nicotine replacement therapy only group, which is odd. And my hunch is, you see some of these outliers at the top, my hunch is that actually the so-called nicotine replacement only people, their nicotine replacement wasn't doing it for them, and so they were having a crafty fag at least sometimes. Although it is true that tobacco-specific nitrosamines are found in some nicotine replacement products in levels higher than most e-cigarettes. That's not to say that I'm warning people against nicotine replacement therapy. I never have. I've always been a very strong advocate of nicotine replacement, and maybe partly because of my own experience as a smoker trying to quit. It took me 10 years, and I did it cold turkey every time. So here's a lot more data in a similar kind of study where colleagues at UCL and also at the Roswell Park Clinic, and I think this is Roswell Park data I'm showing you now, looked at, again, top left nicotine replacement. So you see that this time we're comparing cigarette only, e-cigarette only, dual cigarette and e-cigarette, and no nicotine. products ever. And you can see that in the top left, the first three categories are all getting fairly chunky delivery of nicotine, but e-cigarettes delivering less nicotine. And of course, as you would expect, people who don't have any nicotine consumption at all aren't being exposed to very much nicotine at all. And then if you look at the various different toxicants, and we have a range of toxicants, including some carcinogens, some that are problematic. You guys will know much better than me. Cardiovascular and respiratory risks here. And not always, but generally, we see the risks of e-cigarettes being much lower than smoking, and actually not far off the never nicotine consumers. And what's worth remembering is that almost all of these e-cigarette users, even the ones who are only using e-cigarettes, are former smokers. So many of them will bring with them a lifetime of exposure to tobacco smoke, and some of them may be relatively recent quitters. So bringing perhaps exposure to tobacco products in the last 6 months. So not without risk, but I think this gives you a sense of how different e-cigarette only risk is to tobacco smoke. So on the right-hand side, those are people who are smoking. Sorry, on the left-hand side, those are people who are smoking. On the right-hand side, those are people who aren't smoking, some of whom are vaping. So you can see that pretty much if you're smoking, then you have very high rates of exposure. And just taking an e-cigarette on top of that doesn't magic away the toxicants from smoke. So what about passive exposure? So again, this is a pretty good example of people looking at the same data and coming to different conclusions. I thought this was a really interesting study. I looked at this. It seemed to me that smoking was associated with really high levels of particulate exposure, and e-cigarettes much lower, comparable to, but slightly above, not zero, but slightly not far above the two smoke-free homes in the study. I concluded this to be a big reduction. The authors concluded this to be particulate exposure greater than zero, and therefore recommended that vaping should be discouraged indoors. We can come back and discuss this more. This is definitely your area of expertise, much more than mine. But we have another study here, an Italian study that looks at these heated tobacco products. IQOS is one they looked here, and what you do, it's not like an e-cigarette as you and I might know it. These are products available in the UK, but rarely used. They heat tobacco, but they don't produce combustion, and then you inhale the vapor. And they compared that with traditional manufactured cigarettes and hand-rolled cigarettes, and you see this big spike in particulate matter in the combusted tobacco products. The long tail, which excuse me, which doesn't get back to zero while while they were monitoring it, and that compares with e-cigarettes, where you do get and these hand-rolled. So these heated tobacco products, where you do get an increase in particulate matter, but it's smaller and it falls sooner. And of course, not all particulate matter is the same. Again, you guys can tell me more about this, but smoke is plainly hazardous particulate with carbon, black carbon in it, etc. And e-cigarette vapor is not the same. So here we are. So this is another study from 2017, which compared different nicotine products and tobacco products used indoors, and so you will see that the purple line is where the product is being used and the frequency of the product being used, and the black line is the control, and you can see that for all the combusted products, except for, strangely, for pipes, which of course are used very infrequently, there's a clear excess of particulate matter over the normal, except with e-cigarettes. And then marijuana and drugs, smoked other drugs other than marijuana. And I think, again, we're not usually talking about combustion in the same way, and we're not talking about the same level, the same frequency and volume of use as we see in, for example, in marijuana use. But this is another interesting study, and this looks at not just particulates. It does look at particulates, but it looks at nicotine, because there's a concern, of course, that exhaled e-cigarette vapor may well be rich in nicotine, as we know it is, and it looks at black carbon too. And so, as you'd expect, that lower line for I don't know if you can, yeah. So the red, thick red line is the nicotine from cigarettes. The thin red line is the nicotine from e-cigarettes. So there's definitely some in the air when people are vaping, but rather less. Then we've got PM10 from cigarettes as the thick green line, and PM10 for e-cigarettes as a thin green line. It does it even rise above baseline? That's kind of hard to say. And then we have black carbon, where there's a sharp increase in the cigarettes, so that thick black line, and then the thin black line. You guys will have to give me your view on that. That seems like variability in background levels to me that might be produced by something else. Okay, now how does that all apply to the issue of vaping at work? Well, quite some time ago, PHE engaged in a public discussion where we got experts with different opinions to do us videos. We had 5 propositions. We got one expert giving the case for proposition, or well-disposed to proposition, another expert skeptical of the proposition. We had, and 5 propositions, and then we got people to kind of make submissions having watched those expert opinions. Or not, they didn't have to watch the opinions. They could give us an uninformed view if they wanted, and several did. So the first proposition was that we thought it was really important to distinguish between vaping and smoking. It's always seemed to me that these are fundamentally different activities, and conflating them is harmful for everybody. Protecting bystanders, we plainly an important issue. I got into tobacco control in the long fight for smoke-free public places when I was working as head of policy at ASME UK. Protecting children and young people, again, extremely important. We don't really want young people using any nicotine products, and we certainly want to do all we can to reduce their smoking. Supporting smokers to quit, because actually you're not doing kids a great favor if you protect them from smoking, but their parents expose them to secondhand smoke, or spend a household budget on tobacco, or die early. And supporting smoke-free policies, which is in itself an important thing. And there was concern, a lot of concern, which I understood well, about whether the use of e-cigarettes might risk undermining smoke-free policies. And so we had a very positive response to most of these proposals, and a detailed response. In many cases, they gave us lots of food for thought, and we tweaked these proposals to make them more informed by the opinions that our participants gave us. And there were, as you can see, about 700, 800 responses to most of these questions. I mean, there were additional responses where they just expressed their view without expressing views on the specific propositions, but they were harder to include in our analysis. So here we are with our 5 propositions, and basically this was a reflection on some work done by ASH, the UK Centre on Alcohol and Tobacco Studies, and the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, where they weren't telling you what to do, but they were just encouraging you to ask 5 questions before you made up your mind. Ask yourself 5 questions. When they offered PHE a chance to sign up to that statement, we said, oh, PHE doesn't ask questions, PHE provides answers. Well, we couldn't do that. That was hubris, but what we were able to do was offer some propositions. So we thought it was really important not to conflate vaping with smoking. As I say, it's harmful to health. It's just not true. I know that nicotine products are considered tobacco products in the US, and that's been adopted elsewhere, but that was really largely, I think, for expedience, American legal expedience, to bring nicotine products, e-cigarettes, under the aegis of the FDA. So protecting bystanders is absolutely important, but making vapors stand with smokers, I'm not sure that that's a great idea. It's not a great idea because you're exposing people to secondhand smoke, particularly people who are trying to make a quit attempt. I also had concerns about whether that was really supporting their quit attempts. It's positively sadistic if you've got somebody who's trying to make trying to quit smoking, making them go and stand beside people who are smoking whenever they need to take their nicotine products. Actually, the vapors who responded to this generally said that it wasn't a problem, and when vapors stood beside smokers, it was more likely that the smokers would try the vapes than the other way around. Protecting children, very important, and we would say tougher measures indeed for schools. And in my view, I would, my own advice would be to prohibit the possession of any age restricted products on school. And so teachers shouldn't be bringing cigarettes onto school, e-cigarettes, alcohol, knives. If there's an age restriction on a product, don't take it into school. And certainly e-cigarettes I would bring into that category. Nicotine replacement therapy, incidentally, is available to over 13s. And support smoke-free policies. Look, I just think a sensible approach to this, to vaping, helps to build compliance. When we were testing this, we did it with Public Health England employees too. We did some workshops because we thought PHE employees might be a bit sensitive about this policy on vaping, where basically we were going to say, you can't vape indoors, but you can vape on the grounds. You can't smoke anywhere. And one of the participants said to me that because the existing policy required him to vape off the grounds, so if he wanted his nicotine replacement, he would have to leave his desk, leave his office, leave the grounds and stand by the gate. What he would have to do then to get enough nicotine in a short enough time, because cigarettes deliver a faster, stronger dose of nicotine, he would have to smoke a cigarette. So he didn't smoke at home. He didn't smoke when he was out with his mates, but he only smoked when he was working at Public Health England. A massive own goal for Public Health England. So, okay, on that unusual note of humility, I'm going to hand it over to you for questions.
Thanks very much. That's absolutely brilliant overview, Martin. We do have questions. One from Beth saying, is there any data that shows the number of people that stop smoking by vaping who then go on to stop using nicotine products completely, and how long that transition takes, and how the length of that transition compares to other nicotine replacement therapy?
Okay, Nick, if I think I'm trying to stop sharing now because people don't have to see my, there we go.
That's great.
That's a really interesting question, and it's about what we call smoking trajectories. And what seems to be the case is that it's different for different people, that there's no single trajectory, but we do see a lot of people using who use vapes just stopping using vapes. Sometimes, unfortunately, they're returning to smoking, but sometimes they're going completely nicotine free, and that's great. So I can give you the Dockrell family. So notoriously, I have skin in the game here. My sister was a lifelong smoker until she developed cancer. She gave up smoking when she was in remission, so when she was being treated, but when she went into remission, she relapsed to smoking. She finally quit with a vape, and she is on nicotine-free now. Her daughter was a smoker all her life, and she also quit. She's still using a vape, and she's using low nicotine. Her daughter's boyfriend, again, similar story, uses higher nicotine. The ex-husband, again, a 50-year smoker. This is classic Scottish working class family. But none of them smoke, which is the great thing. So yeah, different roads for different people. And I think it's great to get to nicotine free. But my advice is not to rush, because if you rush, you risk relapse to smoking, and that's where all the damage is done.
Thank you. There's a question about the most appropriate EC to use for physicians, pharmacists. How you work that out? That's
the most appropriate device to use. Well, okay. You want to use something that's fairly easy to use, which has low risk of high enough nicotine delivery, and there's low risk of accidental poisoning. And these products are being used in a number of RCTs. So I'm advising on this new trial of e-cigarettes being offered to people turning up for accident and emergency. If you message me, I can find out for you what the products were used in that and in the tech trial. In fact, not find out, I know, but I just can't recall the brands. So far, we haven't got a medicinally regulated e-cigarette, but I do know that there's some major manufacturers who are currently got products before MHRA. So I've been saying this for a decade, but I'm optimistic. I'm still optimistic that we're going to see a medicinally regulated e-cigarette that then will be prescribable by physicians who feel it's appropriate to prescribe them.
Thank you. I know you covered the evidence uncertainty on vaping and pregnancy, but Sarah Carr has asked about that and about what midwives should do, reluctant to promote and encourage vaping, and then send a message to women to continue smoking. You know, this is difficult, isn't it? I don't know if you've got any thoughts.
Well, it's really difficult, and I was asked this by a tobacco control lead, a local authority tobacco control lead, just yesterday, and it's a bit of a cop-out. When I was at ASH, I helped set up the Smoking in Pregnancy Challenge Group, which was all about reducing smoking in pregnancy, and still is, and it's a collaboration doing great work. And they've come up with the best statement so far, I think. And so if you were to do a quick internet search for Smoking in Pregnancy Challenge Group e-cigarettes, you'll come up with their advice, including an infographic, which, and I don't think, we're just not in a place where we can recommend e-cigarettes for smoking cessation in pregnancy. We see really quite low rates of prescribing NRT for, even though it is recommended by NICE for smoking cessation in pregnancy. But if a woman has stopped smoking using an e-cigarette, don't discourage her. If a woman is trying to stop smoking using an e-cigarette, don't discourage her. It's no doubt she has considered the alternatives, and you might review those alternatives with her, but never discourage a smoker from quitting.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, just a quick one. The difference between EC and NRT, is it essentially regulation that what's the difference?
Oh, very good. So nicotine, the both ways of delivering a nicotine replacement. There are some inhalable nicotine replacement products, and there was recently a product launched in the UK market, which was a kind of nicotine inhaler, which was a thin white tube that, in fact, the development of that product was funded by British American Tobacco. And that really didn't work on the market. They weren't able to sort out the production problems. But there are other inhaled nicotine delivery systems that are medicines. The inhalator is probably the best known. Again, not widely used, and you can get nasal sprays. The most commonly used nicotine replacement therapies, licensed medicines, are chewing gum, patches, and kind of soluble gauze that you can put on your mouth, and the patches give low, slow delivery, and then the gauze and the gum swifter, stronger delivery. When we finally get an e-cigarette that is licensed as a medicine, I think we would consider that a nicotine replacement therapy. The problem that they're encountering at the moment isn't that they're not effective, they're plainly delivering enough nicotine. There are some difficulties about production standards, because production standard has to be higher for medicine quite rarely. And the third area is standard dosage, because you really want a medicine delivered in a standard dose. In fact, smokers are really skilled at titrating their nicotine levels, and they take as much as they need. And that's probably to be encouraged. So I would be less concerned about the standard dosage, but obviously the medicines regulator regard that as an important issue.
Thanks. So Pip has asked about specific patient groups on e-cigarettes for COPD patients.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the few things a smoker can do to improve their COPD is stop smoking. However, inhaling e-cigarettes can be a respiratory irritant, and different mixes of the different people respond differently to different balances of the solution that carries the nicotine, propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin. And so you might try different balances if irritations in the lung are occurring as a result of e-cigarettes. But definitely, I mean, it would be just encourage your smokers with COPD to quit. That's a really important thing. And if they've tried other methods, then why not try them out, or allow them to try an e-cigarette if that's what they want to do, but monitor it carefully to make sure that they're benefiting from it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, thanks, Martin. Christine, you put some stuff in the chat. I don't know if you want to make some comments.
Thanks, Martin. I think it's great. Really good session, really good evidence for people. Some of the challenging issues are around people's understandable, real worry about the links with the tobacco companies, their history in terms of how they behaved. And I wondered, I'm sure you'll come across it all the time, but just your thinking about that.
Yeah, when I was at ASH, I led on 3 big-ish reports into the tobacco industry interference. One, BAT's African footprint, marking 100 years of BAT in Africa, malign influence in Africa. The smoke-filled room was about the way BAT and other tobacco companies seeked to manipulate UK health policy. So it is something that I am acutely aware of. And I think probably I'm the civil servant who makes most noise about Article 5.3 of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So the FCTC is a WHO treaty, WHO's first health treaty, and it provides lots of extremely good advice to parties. And one of them is in Article 5.3, where there's the binding bit of the treaty where it says we have a duty to protect health policy from the vested commercial interests of the tobacco industry. And then there's a whole non-binding guidance on this, and I am always hitting people over the head with the non-binding guidance. I say it might be non-binding elsewhere, but the UK has signed up to the guidance, and you must implement the guidance as look. Most people don't care what this fairly junior civil servant in the outer reaches of the Department of Health has to say. Nonetheless, I make a lot of noise about it. And it's absolutely vital, and especially for people who are interested in tobacco harm reduction, people like me, to be super vigilant, because the tobacco industry are constantly trying to manipulate this. And look, I came up with a proposal a few years ago, and we got it in the green paper, to make smoking obsolete, so that in 10 years' time, we'd be able to take smoked tobacco off the market. We have smoking rates so low and alternative products so good that we could take smoked tobacco off the market and nobody would care. Not long ago, one of the world's biggest companies, tobacco companies, Philip Morris International, made a similar offer. They said they were planning to remove their combustible tobacco products from the UK market. I don't know if they thought they were being helpful. They could not have been less helpful. That just contaminates an authentic public health desire not to sustain their shareholder value, which is their primary concern, and legally I suppose it has to be, but to protect the health of generations of British people and people living in the UK. And so we have to be very vigilant, and we have to shun their incessant efforts to manipulate UK health policy. Look, I noticed that Judith Mackay is in the audience, and Judith is a fantastic tobacco control advocate with way more experience than me, but I'm pretty sure won't have agreed with everything I said. So I don't know if there might be just a minute or two to hear Judith's perhaps.
I've just been messaging Judith because it's just great to see her. I know she's in Hong Kong.
Judith has come off
mute. Yeah, there we go.
Hi, Judith.
Yes, hello. Yes, well, I really work, as you know, in low and middle income countries, and we have a very different view from, this whole business of e-cigarettes and harm reduction products, because we feel that low and middle income countries are struggling with the primary epidemic of combustible tobacco, and to add on a second epidemic of e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products would really be a disaster. And I noticed that about 40 countries now have banned e-cigarettes, and 100 have pretty stringent regulations. So I think there is immense concern in low and middle income countries that e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products are not the way to go. So I realize that England has gone out on a limb, and it will be very interesting to see at the end of the day just how this pans out, because certainly most of the world is in a very different position from England. And from Asia, we sort of look at what's happening in England with some astonishment and amazement that this path has been taken. But we look at America and we see this appalling advertising and promotion, which is not geared towards middle-aged smokers to quit smoking, not at all. It's geared towards kids who are having raves and parties and hanging out with their friends. I mean, it's a clear inducement for young people to actually start using these products. And I think we just don't risk that in most of the low and middle income countries.
Judith, thanks very much. I think probably one of the countries that you would list among your 100 with stringent regulation would probably be the UK. We were among the first to regulate. And I think we've been very effective at preventing youth uptake in the UK, and international tobacco control study data, I think backs that up, shows that we've had lower rates of e-cigarette use, but a more rapid decline. I think it was Mike Dobb who described e-cigarettes as a weapon of mass distraction. And I've come to agree with him, but maybe not in the way he intended. I think that you're right. The world has this massive problem with just a terrible health calamity as a result of combusted tobacco, and that remains my overriding priority. I think it's sometimes overdone, the idea that the UK is out on a limb. I think the work of the New Zealand government with their Quit Strong campaign, with their excellent Vaping the Facts website, I'd love to go and work for the New Zealand government. They've been far more outspoken than the UK. But again, they've had a similar approach. I agree, where really tough regulation, minimizing the risks so that we can maximize the opportunity to get smokers to quit. But just as ever, I'm extremely grateful for your perspective, and I certainly agree. I mean, my academic background was in developing economies, and I know that many of these economies just don't have the same regulatory muscle as we have in developed countries, and I think proper regulation is absolutely essential. I'm afraid I have run out of time, but we could maybe squeeze in one last question if you thought that was appropriate.
I mean, if anyone wants to come off mute and ask that question, I think there's various comments about the WHO's position. People, I think, really appreciate that. There's one final one. Is it, what's the aim? To reduce the use of mind-altering substances or to reduce tobacco use? Yeah.
Okay, so if nicotine is a mind-altering substance, it's certainly a stimulant. I think perhaps mind-altering substance conjures up for me notions of LSD. Nicotine isn't like that. I think the effect of nicotine on the brain is probably more similar to caffeine or indeed sugar than it is to LSD. We don't have time to get into a long debate about the effects on the brain of nicotine. But look, when you get an email from me, it has a footer. It says there are 6 million smokers in England. If they don't stop smoking, 4 million of them will die from smoking-related disease. Smoking is not a trivial thing. We grew up with it. It's been all around us all our lives, but it's not a trivial thing. More people died of smoking in England last year than died of the coronavirus. It is a massive killer. Anything we can do to get smokers to quit, anything we can do to reduce the burden of harm on smokers and their families, my sister's family, my niece's family, my great nephew's family, I'm going to do it. Well, I'm going to do it if the government lets me anyway. I will be advising the government to do it. I will be advising the government to make people's lives better. That's what I'm going to do.
Brilliant. I think on that note, we'll leave it. That's a great ending. And Christine, what a great first speaker of the series. Thanks, Martin, so much. And over to you, Christine, for final words.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for the participants and lots of quotes. Martin's presentation will be, we'll send around the link. It'll be on both Society of Occupational Medicine and C3's website for people to see again or to share. Martin, big thank you. Thanks, Nick, for chairing it, and thank you all the participants. And see you next month, hopefully, when we're going to be looking at obesity and the workplace.